Acolyte was one of the few modern Star Wars projects to grab my attention from the moment it was announced. Of course, back then, due to some theories floating around about a story that at that point we knew nothing about, I was expecting a Plagueis and Palpatine story. That obviously turned out to be incorrect, but when we started receiving actual news about the Acolyte, I remained intrigued. I certainly didn't agree with a lot of the backlash that Leslie Headland was getting, especially since those criticizing her seemed to be bent on misrepresenting both her words and her vision. Plus, I'm generally pretty strongly against judging a story definitively before it's even fully released. But now that Acolyte's first season has completed its run, I'd like to go over it episode by episode and explain what I enjoyed, what some of the problems were, and certain points of backlash that I strongly disagree with. Before we get into it, just a quick heads up, there will be major spoilers in this review. So believe it or not, I'm going to recommend that you actually watch The Acolyte before watching this video. Seriously, worst case scenario, you might get a kick out of it. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get into it. The biggest thing for me about episode 1 was that, no lie, it legitimately felt like a rewrite of that garbage season 5 finale arc in the Clone Wars series. And I love that. I don't know if it was intentional. I am aware that Leslie seems to be on good terms with Filoni, and he influenced the Acolyte to some degree. So I half wonder if this was just a coincidence, or if Leslie was actually referencing that arc in TCW. Anyway, the most notable similarities to me are as follows: the false accusation, the prison breakout and subsequent chase, and the episode ending with the main character pleading innocence to their Jedi Master while standing on the edge of a sheer drop-off. Let me know in the comments below if you picked up on these uncanny similarities. And while you're at it, be sure to give this video a like if you're enjoying, and hit the subscribe button to stay tuned for future content. So here's how I feel the Acolyte improved upon this idea in comparison to how TCW handled it. Starting with the prison breakout. Osha demonstrates faith in the Jedi by refusing to participate in the escape.
So you'd rather leave your fate to the Jedi?
Yes.
As opposed to Ahsoka, who jumps at the chance to break herself out, thus allowing herself to be stupidly baited into making herself look more guilty, after which, having spoken to absolutely no one and being given no indication that this was the case, she claims that no one will believe her closest friends and mentors included.
No one else will believe me.
Osha is ultimately forced to break herself out when the ship she's on starts to crash, but she stops to help someone in need first, thus demonstrating her selflessness. Ahsoka, on the other hand, sees a bunch of injured clones, and instead of stopping to help them, ask who the perpetrator was, literally anything, she simply says, well, this doesn't look good, and books it out of there. Lastly, when standing on the edge of a cliff, Osha accidentally slips and falls, only to be caught by Master Soul with the Force. Ahsoka, after screaming at her master for 5 minutes and unrightfully claiming that no one has her back, yeets herself off the edge, and Anakin doesn't drag her right back with the Force for reasons. And don't at me in the comments claiming it's because he was trusting her to prove her innocence. He made it quite clear that the best way to do that was by pleading her case to the Council. Not to mention he zealously continued the search in the next episode, so that argument clearly doesn't hold water. I swear there are so many times throughout TCW where the Jedi just don't use the Force for no reason. So I was glad to see that this was not an issue in the Acolyte. The Jedi here are almost constantly using the Force. One moment I appreciated in particular was when Soul compelled the prisoner that Osha had rescued to tell the truth about what had happened. It was such a simple and satisfying solution for something that otherwise could have easily turned into stupidly dragged out conflict. But anyway, if you're interested in hearing more reasons as to why the Season 5 5 finale arc in TCW is utterly stupid, maybe check out part 3 of our argument against Ahsoka series, or check out our reaction videos on that arc. Ultimately, I think it's clear which series has the better story and characterization. Osha clearly demonstrates her compassion and unwavering trust, and is overall a character I can get behind, though admittedly she's only my 3rd favorite character in the series, with Sol being my 1st and Jecki being my 2nd. Speaking of Jecki, I feel she has a really strong introduction in this episode. Her first scene establishes her as someone who is surprisingly mature for her age, but she also has this delightful sassiness to her. Maybe it's just me, maybe it's just the fact that we've been largely deprived of enjoyable characters in Star Wars for a long time now, but I'm really appreciating having a cast of characters that I can actually enjoy watching. Now, I don't usually rate stories since my rating system can be incredibly fickle, but if I were to rate The Acolyte, I'd give episode 1 a 4 out of 10. On to episode 2, I admittedly don't have much to say about this one. Watching Sol totally owning May was fun as hell though. We're also introduced to Kamir for the first time, I'll talk more about him later, and we get that tense moment where Osha and May finally come face to face. Overall, I'd say episode 2 gets a 5 out of 10. Moving on to episode 3, the episode that everyone seems to think somehow broke the Star Wars universe, as if it hadn't already been broken. To those of you who think that, I say...
incorrect.
While I do have problems with this episode, Anastasia using the Force to create life is very much not one of them. I see no difference between that and the idea that was introduced in the prequels.
Who was his father?
There was no father.
Where is their father?
They have no father.
Now, I have seen claims that a random witch being able to use this powerful ability is what breaks the universe. But calling Anastasia some random witch just makes it sound like you're purposely being reductive so you can find things to complain about. Anastasia, who is head of her coven and easily able to toy with the minds of Jedi, is clearly a very powerful witch. On the other hand, if you're claiming this idea is bad in Acolyte because it's referencing the prequels and the prequels are bad, there's the door. Goodbye. Okay, let's get into my actual problems with this episode. Namely, the handling of May's character. From the beginning, she seemed to be set up as a sympathetic character. She was trying to avenge some terrible event in her past that she believed killed her entire family. But when we get to see what actually happened, it just paints May as some psycho child who tried to kill her sister for daring to leave, and then getting mad at her when it horrifically backfires.
What have you done? What have you done?
Are you serious?
It felt like it was totally undermining the character. Though given it had all happened from Osha's perspective, I figured there must be information that we were still missing, especially given the sheer guilt we had seen from Torben in the previous episode. So even though I felt it would be quite difficult to redeem May after that whole fiasco, I decided to wait and see how things played out before writing her off completely. Other than that, we got to see more of Sol being the best character in the show.
A mountain.
Correct.
That wasn't a
Overall, episode 3 gets a 3 out of 10. On to episode 4. Again, I don't have much to say here. The Ki-Adi-Mundi cameo honestly completely eluded me in the beginning, and feels so blown out of proportion by the fans. What makes it so ironic is that for years the general consensus was that Mundi was a sociopath who deserved to die, which is completely incorrect. So for people to suddenly act like Mundi has been ruined in their eyes, simply because his age was retconned, and he got a few seconds of screen time and some insignificant dialogue in The Acolyte, feels very hypocritical. And for those who claim Ki-Adi's appearance in The Acolyte makes his line in the prequels about how the Sith have been extinct for millennia make no sense, if you had actually waited for season 1 to conclude rather than immediately jumping to conclusions, you would have seen just how groundless that claim is, since by the end of episode 8, everyone who had explicit confirmation of a Sith presence was either killed off, had their memory wiped, or went into hiding. Plus, Vernestra was running around telling everyone that a rogue Jedi was to blame for the murders. So please, try coming up with some actual criticisms. This episode gets a 2 out of 10. Episode 5 really kicks off. We get to see the Sith absolutely slaying Literally. We get to see Jackie being a badass and no! No! Jackie, no! No! Moving on. So now it's finally time to talk about Khmer, i.e. the Sith. I feel like this was a bad pick. I actually guessed at Khmer being the Sith back in episode 4, but I was hoping I was wrong because the way his character was established as a laid-back pushover made it very hard for me to take him seriously when he was revealed as the Sith. I know this was probably done as a misdirect, but I wish they leaned more into the mystery of this character before revealing him as the Sith. Plus, I feel like the actor doesn't do a very good job of embodying the role. Even when he's trying to be, he doesn't really come off as threatening or imposing unless he's wearing his mask, which is a really cool mask, by the way, and made of cortosis? I love it! Anyway, this issue definitely isn't helped by the fact that the only other time I saw this actor was as Jason Mendoza in The Good Place. If you've seen The Good Place, you'll understand. On to episode 6, another episode that I don't have much to say about. First things first, I never expected to get to see a light whip on screen ever in Star Wars, and I am so stoked that I did. Aside from that, the only thing that bugged me in this episode was the aforementioned lackluster performance of Khmer's actor. Initially, I gave this episode a 7 out of 10, but I felt that was too generous, so I bumped it down to a 4 or 5 out of 10. On to episode 7, where we finally get to see all of what happened that fateful day on Brendok. And man, this episode was brutal. We finally understand why Sol and Torben especially were so torn up with guilt over these events. How Torben allowed himself to be manipulated and Sol allowed his own feelings to cloud his judgment. We finally understand why May hates the Jedi so much. So the question is, does this episode redeem May's character? Unfortunately, not really. If anything, it just makes her look stupid. Oh no, the thing I set on fire is burning! How could this have happened? I get that she's an 8-year-old, but I'm pretty sure even 8-year-olds can comprehend that if you set something on fire, it burns. And it doesn't help that episode 7 seems to be ignoring details of episode 3. Remember when May said this?
You can't stop me. Yes, I can. How? I'll kill you.
Apparently the Acolyte doesn't, or at the very least doesn't want to acknowledge it, because it just skips right over that line in episode 7. And again, yes, May is an 8-year-old. Children get mad and say stupid things that they don't mean. But I can't help but wonder, what was the purpose of this line? Was it just a misdirect in episode 3 to make us believe that May actually wanted to kill her sister and set the fire on purpose? Because if it was, it just feels sloppy. Again, May's character is not handled very well, which is disappointing because the potential was there. But speaking of details, there's a scene right near the end of the episode when Sol is trying to rescue the twins that outright contradicts what was established before. Watch this scene. Now watch this one. Did you spot the difference? In episode 3, as May is falling, Sol is moving toward them. He shouts May's name and lifts one hand to try to catch her, before switching to catch Osha with his other hand. But in episode 7, as soon as both ends of the bridge start to collapse, Sol is already moving toward them. He shouts the names of both girls, and after deciding to drop May, he uses both hands to hold up Osha. It's not a huge difference, but I felt if just a little more thought had been put into both scenes, they could have been better aligned. But honestly, all that aside, that scene in episode 7 was genuinely hard to watch. Before it even happens, you can see in Sol's face the exact moment when he decides to drop May. and it is gut-wrenching. Overall, I'd give episode 7 a 5 out of 10. On to the final episode, the one that had me refreshing the Disney Plus page until the new episode finally dropped. I was pretty wary about whether or not this episode would be able to wrap everything up neatly, but in that department, I'd say it did its job quite well. As for the highlights of this episode, the intercut fight scenes were fantastic. Not to mention the soundtrack went hard in this episode. So what were my problems here? Well, unfortunately, there's a few more than I'd like. Firstly, let's talk about this stupid gremlin, because I haven't talked about him at all yet. So after 4 episodes of having to endure this creature's existence, I have concluded that it is literally just a plot device, and it annoys me. It sabotaged Soul's ship so that the grand finale could happen. And of course, having it be this oh-so-convenient tracker certainly doesn't ease my suspicions that it exists solely as a plot device. But anyway, moving on to Osha, I do find her turning to the dark side an interesting direction to take things in. Heaven knows I've had enough of female protagonists with inconsequential flaws being treated as incorruptible paragons. And having the twist of Osha killing Soul and not May was certainly clever, if a little predictable. Furthermore, having Soul refuse to admit any wrongdoing makes his death all the more tragic. Also, Soul's lightsaber changing from blue to red in Osha's hand was such a cool visual. But it's how Osha was handled afterward that I feel is a problem. Osha has just found out that she's been lied to for almost her entire life. She killed the man she had loved and respected for years, and now she's forced to part with her sister again. She should be more lost and confused and angry than ever. But the framing of her closing scene, the way the music builds, how she stands side by side with Kamir looking out over the water, it makes it seem like I'm supposed to feel that she's finally on her way to having her life figured out. And that should not be the headspace she's in. While I can sort of understand not wanting to leave your star character in a state of devastation, Leslie, you chose to end the season the way you did. You have to lean into that choice. Really, it would only require some minor tweaking. Maybe darken that final scene where Osha's looking out over the water, and instead of having her hand in hand with Kamir, have him standing on the edge of the scene like an unsettling shadow. Show Osha in tears with a look of barely restrained anger on her face. And voila, it was that easy. Now to address the cameos in this episode. I'm pretty sure, and I think most agree with me here, that the guy hanging out in Kamir's cave was Darth Plagueis, which is kind of hilarious, since it means that if Plagueis gets a more prominent role in future seasons of The Acolyte, the original theories about this show being about Plagueis and Palpatine will at least be partially correct. As for the cameo with Yoda, well, I'll get to that later. Ultimately, I'd say episode 8 gets a 6 out of 10. So now for some of my overall thoughts. If there's one thing I feel this show suffers from the most, especially in the beginning, it's breaking the immersion. There are so many little things that just took me out of the story. Things like, why did Indara let May beat up all these guys before finally taking action? Why did this barkeep and his child stick around while a dangerous fight was ongoing? Why couldn't Indara use the Force to protect the barkeep and herself simultaneously? Why weren't the capabilities of these prisoners properly assessed and countered before even putting them on a transport with only one guard to begin with? And these are just questions from episode 1. There are plenty more examples I could list. Another problem relating to this issue is the poor makeup job on the actress for Vernestra. When I look at her, I see a woman wearing green face paint, not a Miri Allen. And it just feels strange when compared to the makeup on Jackie's actress, which I think looks a lot better. But yeah, there's a lot of details like this that clearly required more attention. So if we ever get anything more from Leslie, I hope to see some improvement in this area. On a more positive note, something I really appreciated about this series was the more balanced use of callbacks and references. One aspect of modern Star Wars that I've grown absolutely sick of is the overuse of nostalgia bait. Since Filoni seems to think that jangling keys in the face of his audience every 2 minutes will somehow save his crummy stories. So I was happy to see this trend discontinued in The Acolyte. What callbacks they do have feel much more sensible and spaced out. Clearly, Leslie recognized the importance of having a story stand on its own, which is why she had someone entirely unfamiliar with Star Wars brought in to ensure that her future audience would be able to follow along with her show, even without having a solid grasp of the universe, rather than, giving them homework. Really, the only point in The Acolyte where I felt this aspect wasn't handled well was the ending scene of episode 8 where Yoda appears. It felt almost like a confidence issue, as if Leslie wasn't sure her story was good enough to keep audiences invested for a second season, so she threw in some last-second nostalgia bait. Which, trust me, Leslie, your story did not need. Your show may be far from perfect, but you don't need to stoop down to Filoni's level. In future, maybe consider taking notes from Tony Gilroy instead of the wannabe cowboy. Anyway, given how cheap and meaningless death is in Star Wars nowadays, I have to applaud The Acolyte for having the guts to kill off well-established characters and keeping them dead, even if it broke my heart. Jackie, no! Another positive I feel this show has is the choreography. While it can look a bit janky at times, it's still surprisingly good, which is more than can be said for this abomination. Lord, even Hayden Christensen couldn't save this duel. But anyway, in closing, I wanted to say a few things. I mentioned earlier that The Acolyte's premise had me intrigued, and part of that was due to the fact that Leslie and I almost seem to be sharing some brainwaves, since our Star Wars stories actually shared some core similarities, such as 1, both featuring identical twin sisters, one of whom gravitated toward the dark side and the other primarily toward the light, and 2, both kind of playing with the idea that maybe the Jedi weren't so perfect, though I admittedly never delved too deeply into that idea. And it's these funny little coincidences that have me genuinely wanting to read Leslie's fanfiction. I doubt it would be good, but I still want to read it. Which brings me to my final point, the reason why I titled the video the way I did. Yes, The Acolyte is nothing phenomenal. Definitely not in the same league as something like Andor, but I feel like it's a step in the right direction. So many people want to act like The Acolyte is the worst thing ever when it's clearly not. After all, Ahsoka exists. Speaking of which, check out my rewrite of Ahsoka Episode 1. Link will be in the description. Back when we were all waiting for Kenobi to come out, I was desperately clinging to hope for the franchise. And after Kenobi was released, that hope promptly died. Even Andor, in all of its greatness, wasn't able to bring it back. Though to be fair, I was definitely too harsh on the series in my initial review. I was reductive, overly critical, and even wrote off entire episodes of the series as cliche. Seriously, I apologize to anyone who watched that review and walked away thinking it was an accurate representation of the series. Probably the thing I'm least proud of in my assessment was claiming that Andor wasn't very political. For some stupid reason, my brain decided that this is what politics in Star Wars looked like, so it couldn't possibly look like anything else. Genuinely, don't ask, I don't understand it either. So if you want to see a review that does it justice, check out Lady Knight the Brave's awesome breakdown of the series. I'll link it in the description. But getting back on topic here, with Visions being hit or miss, it didn't really help restore my confidence in the franchise either. I needed something more. And then came The Acolyte, a series with just enough promise that I could no longer consider Andor a one-off. A show I could actually sit down and enjoy, get invested in, create fun theories for, feel for its characters, maybe even be inspired by. Yes, it's a comfortably mediocre series. And nowadays, unfortunately, criticism directed at mediocre stories seems incredibly unbalanced. I actually recently watched a video by Anthony Gramuglia, I seriously hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, wherein he said this.
Our current landscape of criticism doesn't know what to do with okay stories. No one's allowed to just say, it's okay. It's alright. I don't like it. It's fine. You have to say, I love it. It's the best thing in the world. Or, I hate this. This is revolting. It ruined everything. You have to be either at the all-time best or the all-time worst. And anything between those two extremes, you don't have to do with.
And I can't help but agree with this sentiment. I especially saw that sort of reaction with the movie Damsel, which I may or may not talk about in future, where everyone was acting like it was the worst thing ever, when really, it was just a mediocre film. Now, I can absolutely understand sticking by your standards and saying, no, we deserve better than so-so stories. I completely agree. But considering we've been trapped for quite a while now in this era of entertainment that shows a fundamental misunderstanding of storytelling principles, even just seeing a return to the basics through mediocre stories is a step in the right direction. And this is unfortunately something that a lot of online critics don't seem to understand. We are never going to jump from consistently bottom-of-the-barrel stories to consistently great ones. It's just not possible. We need mediocre stories for a stepping stone, which means we need to remember to give credit wherever credit is due. After all, what is the point of inventing things to complain about when we already have plenty of Star Wars material worthy of complaint? We need to recognize a win, however small it might be, and that's part of what we strive to do here on the channel. Offer fair criticism, whether positive or negative. To be honest, it's been really disappointing seeing my own community get sucked into so much of the dishonest criticism and overblown outrage surrounding the Acolyte. So for all of you out there, whether you're a frequent viewer or entirely new here, this is your friendly reminder to give credit where it's due. Even if you absolutely despise the Acolyte with everything in your being, I challenge you to list one good thing about the series in the comments below. And while you're doing that, be sure to give this video a like, share it around, and subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay tuned for future content. And if you're looking for more ways to show support, Patreon and Super Thanks are both options for you to consider. As always, massive thanks to those of you who are already patrons. Your support is hugely appreciated. Don't forget to stay loud and proud, folks. I'm your Alibi, and I will see you next time. Second I start to record, can't talk. What is the English language? Also, this episode ended on a cliffhanger, which made me not happy because it meant I had to wait a whole week to find out what happened. I'm sweating so much, bro. I was told it was gonna be cool down here. I've lost my spot. Lovely. Though lack of clarity certainly isn't a one-off issue in this series. There are a few notable moments throughout where I was left in a state of confusion, such as this scene in the previous episode. What exactly was Anastasia even trying to do here?